She went into labor alone while her millionaire husband smiled for cameras with another woman. He didn't show up at the hospital. He didn't answer her calls. And when she saw the headline, Billionaire CEO Evander Knox attends gala with mystery date, just hours after giving birth to their daughter, something inside her snapped. But what no one expected was what she did next, and what it would do to him. This is Symphony of Love, a channel where we tell not just stories, but lives that break, rebuild, and fall in love all over again. If this story moved you, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Tamsin Rowe never imagined her wedding day would feel more like a business arrangement than a celebration of love. The venue was perfect, of course, an estate carved into a hillside overlooking the ocean, with glass chandeliers strung over an outdoor altar and the scent of imported white peonies thick in the air. Every detail had been curated by a professional planner hired by his assistant. Every guest on the list belonged to his world, not hers. They smiled, clinked champagne glasses, and whispered about the girl from nowhere who had somehow landed the most unattainable man in the city. Tamsin heard them. She always did. But she stood tall in her dress, back straight, smile calm, because she had made a choice to be here. She had said yes when Evander Knox had asked, not with a ring and kneeling knee, but with a glass of whiskey in his office in a single question. Marry me. No games, no drama. Just you and me. It had sounded almost like a deal, not a proposal, but her heart had said yes before her mind caught up. At first, she believed they could build something real out of it. He wasn't cruel, just distant. A man used to control, silence in rooms that bent to his will. With her, he was quiet but gentle, never unkind, never tender either. In the first few weeks, she told herself that love didn't always begin with fireworks. Sometimes it was a slow burn, a gentle unfolding. She memorized his habits, waited up when he worked late, learned how to exist around the sharp edges of his schedule. They barely fought because they barely shared anything vulnerable enough to break. He gave her a credit card, a driver, and a schedule of events she was expected to attend. She gave him trust, patience, and her body, hoping eventually he'd give her his heart. Then came the day she saw the two pink lines. Alone in the guest bathroom with her hand over her mouth and tears stinging her eyes, she realized this could change everything. She waited until he came home late that night, removed his tie, and collapsed into the chair in his study with a sigh that sounded heavier than exhaustion. She told him gently. He didn't react, not at first, just stared at her like she had spoken in a foreign language. Then he said, I'll make sure you have the best doctors. No smile, no embrace, just logistics, arrangements, strategy. As the weeks passed, his presence became more of an echo than a person. He traveled more, missed appointments, sent his driver instead of showing up. When she placed his hand on her growing belly one night and whispered, she kicked, he gave a ghost of a smile and said, I'm sure she'll be strong. Then he went back to his phone. She told herself this was just how he processed things, that the pressure of work, the legacy he carried, the responsibilities he never chose, all of it weighed on him. She waited, hoped, made excuses even to herself. When her third trimester came, so did the loneliness. The house was large, beautiful, and entirely empty. His voice was now something she mostly heard through voicemails and quick check-ins that always ended with, I have to go. She stopped asking for time and started documenting the journey alone. Photos of the nursery she decorated herself, videos of the baby kicking, updates he never asked for, but she sent anyway. On the day her water broke, it was raining hard and the streets were slick with light. She called him twice, then again, no answer. Finally, she called the driver. In the back seat of the black town car, she clutched her stomach and tried not to cry. The contractions came harder. Her mother had passed away years ago. Her father had never been in the picture. Her sister lived hours away. And Evander, the man who was supposed to be hers, was nowhere. At the hospital, the nurses were kind. They asked her if someone would be joining her, and she said, no, it's just me. They didn't press. The pain was intense, but what hurt more was the emptiness beside her. She gritted her teeth, gripped the rails, and screamed through the delivery. And when Zadie was placed on her chest, tiny and warm and pink, Tamsin cried, not from pain, but from the sheer overwhelming force of love. and the absence of the one person she had once thought would never leave her alone. Hours later, still holding her baby, still swollen and exhausted, she looked at her phone. No missed calls, no messages. She opened a news site on instinct, not even knowing why. And there he was, Evander Knox, in a tuxedo, arm around a woman in a red dress. Headline: Billionaire CEO attends gala with mysterious companion. The timestamp was 3 hours ago. While she was screaming in a delivery room, he had been smiling for the cameras. Something inside her didn't break. It went quiet, a stillness too cold to name. She looked down at her daughter and whispered, "You deserve better." "So do I." And in that moment, Tamsin Rowe decided she wouldn't beg for his presence. She wouldn't chase his shadow. She would raise her daughter, and if he wanted to find his way back, he'd have to fight for a place that used to be his by default. Because it wasn't anymore. Tamsin left the hospital 2 days after giving birth, not in a chauffeured car with luxury seats and monogram blankets like the media might have imagined, but in a rideshare booked quietly from her phone. She held Zadie close in her arms, wrapped in a second-hand blanket her sister had mailed weeks ago, and gave the driver her sister's address instead of the mansion she technically still lived in. She hadn't spoken to Evander once since the night she gave birth. There had been no call, no text, not even a message from one of his assistants. She thought maybe he would come to the hospital eventually, maybe with flowers and excuses and tired eyes that pretended guilt. But the hours turned to days and no one came. The room had remained painfully silent. Lark, her younger sister, was waiting on the porch in sweatpants and messy hair, her eyes wide and full of questions, but she didn't ask anything. She simply opened her arms, helped Tamsin inside, and whispered, "Stay as long as you need." Inside the modest townhouse, everything smelled like cinnamon and laundry detergent. It was warm, imperfect, and full of life, so unlike the sterile emptiness of her life with Evander. The guest room had been hastily prepared, the crib assembled but crooked, the mobile above it missing one star. Tamsin cried when she saw it, and Lark pretended not to notice. The days blurred together in exhaustion. Zadie woke every 2 hours, needing to be fed, changed, rocked. Tamsin, sleep-deprived and aching in ways she hadn't expected, tried to stay strong. But every time she reached for her phone out of habit, every time she wondered if today would be the day he called, she hated herself a little more. She had loved him once. She still did. In some corner she didn't want to admit existed. But that love was becoming something unrecognizable. Bitterness, resentment, confusion. On the 5th day, she opened her email and saw a forwarded link from a friend she hadn't heard from in months. The subject line was blank. The message contained only a link. She clicked it. It was a tabloid blog, a less reputable one, but with sharp teeth and eager claws. There were photos of Evander and the same woman from the gala. More intimate this time. They were stepping out of a car together, close. Her hand rested lightly on his chest. The article speculated on whether he had moved on after a quiet separation from his wife. Some lines referred to Tamsin as a former waitress-turned-socialite, as if she had been a passing experiment. One commenter wrote, "Well, what did she expect? You can't turn dust into diamonds?" Tamsin stared at the screen, numb. Her milk had just come in. She was leaking, sore, and trembling with hormones and exhaustion. And the man whose name she still legally carried was walking red carpets with someone else. She closed the laptop. Then she stood and walked to the crib, where Zadie lay fussing softly. She lifted her daughter, pressed her cheek to that tiny forehead, and whispered, "You're the only part of this that's real." Later that night, while Zadie slept on her chest, Tamsin drafted a letter in the Notes app of her phone. Not to send, just to survive. "Dear Evander," she typed, "you missed her first breath. You missed the moment she grabbed my finger like she already knew me. You missed the way she opened her eyes and looked at me like I was her whole world. And the worst part is, I didn't even expect you anymore. I knew deep down you wouldn't come, but I still hoped. And that's what hurts most, that even now, after everything, I hoped." She didn't finish it. She just saved it and put the phone away. The next morning, she received her first message from him. Not a call, not a video, just a short, cold text from an unfamiliar number. "I've wired money to your account. Let me know if you need more." That was all it said. No, "How are you?" No, "How is she?" Just money, as if that could repair what he had shattered. Tamsin read the message again and again until her hands shook. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She blocked the number. She didn't need his money. She didn't need his silence packaged as support. What she needed was someone who showed up, who stayed, who cared. And Evander Knox, for all his power and charm and influence, had proven one thing with absolute clarity. He didn't know how to love anyone he couldn't control, but she wasn't broken anymore. She had Zadie, she had herself, and maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to start over. The first time Tamsin saw Evander again, it wasn't in person, it was on television. Zadie was 3 weeks old, colicky and restless, and Tamsin had been pacing the living room floor in her sister's robe, trying to soothe the baby with the rhythm of her steps and the soft lull of background noise. The TV was on for company more than anything else, a muted segment of a late-night business show. But then she saw his face on the screen, confident, immaculate, familiar in a way that made her heart twist. The Chiron below read, Knox Global CEO confirms strategic acquisition in Europe amid rumors of personal split. A few seconds later, the screen cut to a clip from a recent press event where Evander stood beside the same woman from the gala. She was smiling at him with practiced ease, her hand lightly brushing his shoulder, and he didn't move away. The host's voice returned, smug and speculative, suggesting that the billionaire may have traded vows for new ventures, and that sources close to the couple claimed the marriage was functionally over. Tamsin felt like the floor tilted beneath her. She turned the TV off and held Zadie tighter, her fingers trembling against the baby's tiny back. She knew the media didn't know the whole story, but it still cut deep. Being erased so easily, like her love, her presence, even her pain, had been nothing more than a footnote in his carefully curated image. Later that night, Lark came home from her shift at the bookstore to find Tamsin curled up on the couch, staring at nothing, Zadie asleep in the crook of her arm. Lark sat beside her without asking questions and waited until Tamsin spoke. When she did, her voice was low, almost detached. He's building a new life while mine hasn't even healed yet, she said. He gets to wear perfect suits and shake hands while I'm still bleeding. Lark didn't offer cliches or soft comforts. She simply said, then don't let him take your voice too. That night, after Zadie finally settled, Tamsin opened her laptop and wrote again. Not to him, not even to herself. She wrote to remember. She wrote about the girl who had walked into that corporate building 2 years ago, carrying coffee trays for people who never learned her name. She wrote about how Evander had noticed her not because of beauty or charm, but because she had quietly corrected a legal clause during a meeting where she wasn't even meant to speak. She had impressed him, not by flirting or flattering, but by being right. That was the moment it all began, when he had asked her, "What's your name?" Not as a formality, but as a challenge. She remembered how alive she felt then, how wanted, how seen. She wrote all of it down, and with every word, she stopped feeling like a victim and started feeling like someone waking up from a long, strange dream. 2 days later, a package arrived at Lark's apartment. It was hand-delivered, no return address. Inside was a pale gray envelope with her name in Evander's handwriting and a stack of papers bound with a gold clip. The letter was short. No apology, no warmth, just formality. Tamsin, I've arranged the details for the separation. You'll find the proposed terms enclosed. I'm ensuring you and the child have everything you need. You're free to contact legal if you have edits. No need to respond directly. Evander. The last line was the one that struck her most. No need to respond directly. It wasn't just avoidance. It was a boundary, a wall. He was telling her, in the most polished and professional way, that he was done. She read the terms. A penthouse apartment in her name, a private stipend, medical coverage for Zadie, custody to be negotiated. There was even a section detailing a public relations statement they could release together to appear amicable. But then she saw it. A single line buried in the clause about reputational protection. It stated that Tamsin agreed not to make any public claims of emotional distress, misconduct, or reputational harm against Mr. Knox directly or indirectly. That was when the tears came. Not because he was trying to protect himself, but because he still didn't see her as a person. She was a threat now, a problem to contain. Not the woman who had carried his child. Not the woman who had waited in a hospital room for him to walk through the door and become the man she believed he could be. She closed the envelope. She folded the letter. Then she placed it all back in the box and slid it under the couch. She didn't know what her next move would be yet, but it wouldn't be silence. It wouldn't be submission. It wouldn't be him getting the last word. Tamsin began to write him letters, not to send, but to survive. Every night after Zadie fell asleep, she would sit in the quiet of Lark's living room with the baby monitor on the table and a legal pad in her lap. She didn't light candles or play music. She just wrote. At first the words came in fits and starts, jagged with exhaustion and rage, but over time they grew steadier, sharper. The letters were not poetic or sentimental. They were confessions, indictments, sometimes screams written down in ink. She wrote about the pain of childbirth and how the silence in the delivery room was louder than any scream. She wrote about the humiliation of seeing her life dissected in headlines by people who had never met her. She wrote about the shame she felt for still loving parts of him, for waking up sometimes thinking she heard his voice. And she wrote about Zadie, about how their daughter had his eyes and her temper, and how no matter what, Tamsin would make sure she grew up knowing she was wanted, even if only by one parent. She never showed Lark the letters, though she suspected her sister knew. Lark had always been intuitive, sensitive to emotional undercurrents, and she didn't push Tamsin to talk unless the silence got too thick. Instead, she helped where she could, taking Zadie for walks, cooking too much food, and occasionally leaving small gifts on Tamsin's pillow, like peppermint oil for headaches or soft socks she found on clearance. Those small kindnesses felt like lifelines. Still, there was a hollow ache in Tamsin's chest that even comfort couldn't fill, the kind that doesn't fade with sleep or food or time. It was the ache of betrayal layered over abandonment, a bruise that no one else could see. One night, Tamsin got a call from an unknown number. It was nearly midnight, and Zadie had just drifted off after hours of crying. Tamsin let the phone ring twice before answering, her voice low. "Hello?" There was a pause, and then she heard his voice, Evander's voice, tired and low, like gravel scraping under velvet. "I know you don't want to hear from me," he said, "but I wanted to know if she's okay. If you're okay." Tamsin didn't respond right away. Her hand clenched around the phone. Part of her wanted to scream, another part wanted to hang up, but something heavier, sadder, kept her still. "You should have asked that 3 weeks ago," she said quietly. "You should have been there." He didn't argue, didn't make excuses. "I know," he said simply. "I was afraid." She almost laughed at that. "You? You're afraid of boardrooms and billion-dollar deals, but not a baby?" He hesitated. "I wasn't afraid of the baby. I was afraid of how much I wanted to be good at this, and of how badly I knew I'd fail." The silence stretched. Tamsin could hear her own breath, shallow and unsure. "You already did," she said. "You failed the second you chose your ego over your family." He didn't answer. After a long pause, he said, "I saw a photo of her in the background of one of Lark's posts. She looks like you." Tamsin almost replied, but the words lodged in her throat. He continued, softer now. "I'm sorry I wasn't there. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to know that." She ended the call without saying goodbye. The next day, she didn't speak of it to Lark. Instead, she opened her notepad and wrote another letter. This one was shorter, tighter, a single page. "You're not allowed to want pieces of this after you walked away from the whole thing. You don't get to drop in like a ghost and act like you care. If you wanted us, you would have stayed. But you didn't. You left us in the dark." She folded it, tucked it into the stack, and pushed it to the back of the drawer. Weeks passed. Zadie began to grow faster, smile brighter, laugh louder. With each new milestone, her first real smile, her first time grabbing Tamsin's finger with intent, Tamsin felt more rooted, not healed, but stable. She started helping Lark at the bookstore part-time, bringing Zadie in a sling and working at the register while customers cooed over the baby. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it gave her space to breathe. Some nights she'd stay after closing and sit in the poetry aisle, reading pages aloud to Zadie in a low voice, as if words could knit together all that had unraveled. Then one afternoon, a delivery arrived at the shop. No flowers, no jewelry. Just a thick envelope sealed in dark navy blue wax. Inside was a letter in Evander's handwriting, formal but trembling at the edges, and with it a check. Not for child support, not for guilt. It was for $25. The memo line read, "For the first story you'll write about surviving this." Tamsin stared at it for a long time. He wasn't buying her silence. He was acknowledging her voice. It didn't make everything okay. It didn't undo the silence or the betrayal, but it was the first thing he'd done that felt even remotely human. And that was something. The envelope from Evander remained on the kitchen table for 2 days before Tamsin touched it again. She didn't cash the check. She didn't respond to the letter. Instead, she placed both in a shoebox along with the other things she wasn't ready to deal with yet. Zadie's hospital bracelet, a picture from their wedding that she couldn't bring herself to tear, and the first ultrasound printout she had found at the bottom of her purse. It wasn't that she forgave him. She didn't. But she was starting to realize forgiveness and moving on weren't the same thing. Some days she still cried in the shower, holding the curtain like it might hold her together. Other days she walked to the bookstore with Zadie pressed to her chest, pretending that life was simple again. But inside her, a new clarity had begun to form. She couldn't rewrite what happened, but she could stop letting him be the author of her future. Then came the legal notice. It arrived by courier, signed and certified, the pages thick and crisp in that cold, expensive way only corporate lawyers could manage. Tamsin waited until Zadie was napping before opening it. The language was sterile, but the intent was obvious. It was the formal divorce agreement, complete with all the stipulations Evander had hinted at. Property transfers, monthly allowances, non-disclosure clauses. But what made her stomach turn was the section titled Public Image and Protection of Legacy, which stated that Tamsin would not speak publicly or publish any written material, fictional or otherwise, regarding her experience during the marriage, without prior approval from Knox Global's legal counsel. It was a muzzle dressed up in legal language, a way to make her disappear politely. Tamsin read the clause 3 times. Her hands were shaking, not with fear, but with a kind of fury she hadn't felt in weeks. He didn't just want to walk away clean. He wanted to erase the mess he made, wipe it off his name, and keep smiling in boardrooms while she sat in silence. For the first time, the pain twisted into something sharper than grief. It became resolve. She picked up her phone and called the number listed for Evander's legal representative. When a polished voice answered, she didn't introduce herself gently. She said, "Tell Mr. Knox I don't sign things that ask me to lie about my own life." She hung up before they could respond. Later that evening, she told Lark everything. They sat at the kitchen table while Zadie babbled in a bouncer nearby. Tamsin explained the clause, the tone of the letter, the suffocating politeness of it all. Lark's eyes narrowed, her fingers curling around her mug. "He's scared," she said. "That's what this is. He knows you have something powerful. Your story." Tamsin hadn't thought of it that way, but the words settled in her chest like truth. Maybe Evander had finally realized that love wasn't his only loss. He was losing control of the narrative. And that, for a man like him, was worse than heartbreak. The next morning, Tamsin did something she hadn't done since the wedding. She put on makeup. Not much. Just enough to hide the fatigue under her eyes, to remind herself of the woman who used to look in mirrors with purpose. She dressed in clean jeans and a soft sweater, tucked Zadie into the stroller, and walked straight to the law office listed in the documents. The receptionist looked surprised when she gave her name, but politely asked her to wait. 15 minutes later, a tall, silver-haired attorney in a charcoal suit stepped into the lobby and invited her into a glass-walled conference room. He introduced himself as Richard Bray, said he represented Mr. Knox, and asked how he could help. Tamsin didn't sit. She placed the unsigned agreement on the table and looked him straight in the eye. "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to decline. If Mr. Knox wants a clean divorce, he can have it. But I won't be silenced. I won't be paid off, and I won't be treated like an afterthought in a story I helped build." The lawyer tried to maintain a neutral expression, but she could see the flicker of surprise in his eyes. She continued, her voice steady. "Tell him to send me something that respects me as the mother of his child, not as a risk to be managed." She walked out before he could answer. That night, she sat down and wrote a letter. This time, it wasn't one to burn. She printed it, folded it neatly, and mailed it to Evander's office. It was only 3 lines long. "You left me in the dark. You let the world think I was a mistake. I'm not. No signature, no address, just the truth." She didn't know what his response would be, or if he'd respond at all. But for the first time since the night she gave birth, Tamsin felt like she had taken something back. Not his name, not his money. Her voice, Evander Knox, stared at the letter on his desk for a long time before touching it. He had it delivered unopened, hand-carried by his assistant, who only said, "From her. No return address." The envelope was thin and white, ordinary except for the heaviness it seemed to carry. When he finally opened it and read the 3 lines, he felt something in his chest shift. Not the kind of dramatic realization found in movies, but something colder, smaller, quieter. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't begged. She had simply told him what he had done, and it hurt more than all the accusations he'd rehearsed responses for in his head. That evening, for the first time in weeks, he didn't go to his penthouse or the private dinner he had scheduled with shareholders. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the city with no destination, past the places he and Tamsin had once visited before things grew cold between them. He parked in a quiet lot behind the public library, a place she used to go to on her days off, and sat there watching the building in silence. His phone buzzed over and over with calls, reminders, press alerts. He ignored them all. It had been easy to push her aside when she was silent, when she was too heartbroken to fight. But now with one letter, she had reminded him who she really was, a woman who never needed to shout to be right. The next day, the fallout began. Not from the letter, but from a series of internal audits at Knox Global that had started to uncover things Evander had always meant to clean up, but never prioritized. Old decisions, shortcuts made in the early growth stages, were now surfacing in the hands of legal teams and investors. The whispers began about governance, about him being distracted, about the board considering interim leadership. It didn't matter that most of it was exaggerated. In business, perception often mattered more than fact. And the perception now was that Evander Knox, once the golden boy of modern industry, was slipping. He spent hours in meetings defending himself, answering questions, and reassuring allies. But at night, he found himself staring at his phone again. He didn't call Tamsin, not yet, but he wrote drafts of messages he never sent. He looked at the photo of Zadie that had been printed in the corner of a gossip blog and realized how little he knew about his own child. Her sleep patterns, her smile, her sounds. Guilt wasn't new to him, but this guilt didn't fade like the others. It didn't come with rationalizations, it just stayed. Then one night something broke in him, not with noise, but with weight. He sat down at his desk, opened his private email account, and began writing. Not to Tamsin, but to himself in a way. One message became 2, then 5, then 10. He titled the folder, "Letters She'll Never Read." In each, he wrote about a memory he hadn't shared with her, about the first time he saw her cry at a film, about how terrified he was the day she told him she was pregnant, and how he wanted to run because he didn't believe he'd ever be worthy of fatherhood. He wrote about his own father, the man who taught him success mattered more than softness. He wrote about the gala, the lie of that night, how he used someone else's attention to punish her for needing him, and how it had backfired so completely that even now, months later, he hated the man he'd become. Over the course of 2 weeks, he wrote 47 letters, one for each day he hadn't been there. Some were long, others short. Some were angry, some were almost ashamed, but none of them made excuses. He didn't plan to send them. He just didn't know how else to carry the weight of what he'd done. Meanwhile, Tamsin began to notice something strange. The legal team that had been aggressively pursuing the NDA clause suddenly went silent. The follow-up calls stopped. The pressure vanished. And then a message came from a different lawyer, not one tied to Knox Global, but an independent family law specialist. He requested a meeting to discuss a more respectful revision of the divorce agreement. The tone was new, professional but not forceful, cautious. She agreed to meet, but made clear it would be on her terms. The lawyer arrived alone, in a modest suit, carrying only one folder. He didn't speak in rehearsed lines. He simply handed her a new draft and said, "He asked that I listen, not persuade. He's not asking you to give anything. He just wants to make sure you don't feel like you were erased." She read the new draft carefully. No NDA, no control clauses. Just clean terms, fair custody discussions, full parental acknowledgement, and then, at the very bottom, a line in Evander's own handwriting. It wasn't legal language. It wasn't a plea. It said only this: "If I can't undo the past, I'm willing to carry it." She folded the papers slowly and looked at the lawyer. He's starting to understand, she said, but he's not there yet. And that night, for the first time, she took all the letters she had written and moved them from the drawer into a box with a label on the lid. The label didn't say Evander. It didn't say divorce. It said truth, because she was done hiding. The courthouse was quieter than Tamsin expected. It didn't look like the ones in movies with grand staircases and sweeping declarations of justice. It was just a clean, echoing space filled with people trying to move forward, to untangle lives that had once been woven together too tightly. She arrived 15 minutes early, Zadie in her arms and Lark at her side. Her palms were damp, not from fear but from the weight of everything that had brought her here. Every ignored call, every sleepless night, every letter that never had a reader. This wasn't a confrontation, it was a reckoning. Evander arrived 5 minutes late, alone, without assistance or legal guards flanking him. He looked different. Not broken, not pathetic, but stripped down. Like the version of himself that had finally stepped out from behind the title. His suit was still pressed, but his face was tired. The sharp edge he usually wore like armor had been softened by something else. Something that looked a little like humility. He didn't look at her immediately. His eyes found Zadie first. She was asleep against Tamsin's chest, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. The air around them thick with the tension of things unsaid. The hearing was short. Their lawyers spoke in calm, neutral tones. There was no fight, no bitterness traded across the room. The terms had been quietly agreed on days before. Custody was to be shared with flexibility, assets divided without drama. But the judge still asked the required questions. Were both parties present? Did both parties understand the terms? Was this decision mutual? When it came time to speak, Tamsin nodded and said yes. Her voice didn't shake. She had already broken too many times to do it again now. Then unexpectedly, the judge paused and looked at Evander. Is there anything you wish to add, Mr. Knox, before I finalize this? There was a silence, a long one. Then Evander stood slowly, like a man rising, not because he had to, but because he couldn't stay seated a second longer. Yes, Your Honor. With your permission. The judge gave a nod and Evander turned, not to the judge, not to the room, but to Tamsin. And then, in front of the court, the legal teams, and 3 strangers waiting for their own hearings, he said, I've spent the last year building things that made me rich and losing the only thing that ever made me human. Tamsin didn't move. I've spent the last 47 nights writing letters to a woman I never really deserved, trying to figure out where I stopped being someone she could trust. And the truth is, I stopped trying to be a husband before I ever really learned how. I hurt you. I abandoned you. And I let the world think you were a mistake when you were the only thing that made me better. Someone coughed behind them. A pen dropped. The judge didn't interrupt. Evander continued, voice lower now. I'm not saying this to win you back. I know better. I'm saying it because you deserve to hear it without a lawyer translating. I loved you in all the wrong ways. Quietly from a distance, and only when it was convenient. And that's not love. That's cowardice. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He didn't hand it to her. He placed it on the table between them. This isn't a legal document. It's not a letter. It's just a photo. The first time I saw her, the one time I didn't look away. Tamsin glanced at it. She didn't open it. Not yet. The judge cleared her throat. Is that all? Evander nodded. Yes, Your Honor. The hearing ended. The papers were signed. The marriage, in the eyes of the state, was officially dissolved. Outside the courthouse, Tamsin sat on the stone steps with Zadie in her lap and the envelope resting beside her. Evander stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, the wind catching the ends of his coat. For a long moment, they didn't speak. Then he said, I'm not asking to come back. I just want to be there. For her. For whatever part of this you'll let me earn. Tamsin looked down at Zadie, who was blinking up at the gray sky. Then she looked back at Evander. You don't get to earn your way back with words. I know, he said, but I'm still going to try. She stood slowly. Her body was tired, her heart still guarded, but something in her eyes had softened. Then start with this, she said, holding out the diaper bag. She hates car rides. If you're serious, you'll learn to soothe her screaming. Evander took the bag, stunned. Now? There's no later, she said. That's what you taught me. And as he followed her down the courthouse steps, adjusting the strap over his shoulder, something shifted. Not a reconciliation, not yet, but a beginning. For the first time in their entire story, they were walking forward at the same pace. Evander showed up every Sunday at 9 a.m. without being asked. He never came late, never made excuses, and never tried to enter the apartment unless Tamsin invited him. At first, he would only stay for an hour, long enough to change Zadie, feed her, and take her on a walk while Tamsin caught her breath. Over time, the visits grew longer. Zadie learned to recognize his voice and would squeal with laughter when he lifted her into the air. It wasn't instant magic, but something quieter and steadier, like stone weathering into shape under gentle, constant rain. Evander didn't try to prove anything. He just stayed, and for a man who had once vanished during the most important moment of her life, that was a radical shift. Tamsin watched all of this cautiously at first. She wasn't quick to trust gestures or routines. She'd seen what charm could cover up. But Evander no longer spoke like someone trying to fix a mistake. He spoke like someone who accepted the damage and wanted to carry his half of the weight. He stopped sending gifts. He stopped making offers. Instead, he asked questions. What Zadie liked to eat, what calmed her when she cried, what bedtime songs worked best when the night stretched long. One afternoon, he asked if he could attend her next doctor's appointment. He brought a notebook. He took notes. Lark was the one who pointed it out first. He's different, she said, drying dishes while Tamsin bounced Zadie on her hip. Not perfect, but different. Tamsin didn't deny it. She didn't affirm it either. Instead, she admitted something she hadn't said aloud. I don't know if I want him back, she said, but I'm starting to believe he could be good for her. That admission felt like shedding armor, not because it meant she had to forgive him, but because it meant she no longer needed to protect herself with anger. Then came the letter, not from Evander, but from an editor at a small online literary journal. They had found one of Tamsin's essays, an anonymous submission about childbirth, betrayal, and quiet strength. The editor didn't know her name, but wanted to publish it. She stared at the message for a long time, then looked at the folder she kept under her bed, the one marked Truth. It was filled with pages from all the nights she bled onto paper when she couldn't sleep, when she hated him, when she hated herself. For missing him, those pages weren't polished, but they were real. And maybe finally it was time to let someone else see them. She said yes. The piece went live under the title, The Night I Birthed Myself Too. It didn't go viral, but it reached people. Comments trickled in. Women who had felt forgotten in hospital rooms, partners who had been abandoned at their most vulnerable, strangers who thanked the anonymous author for putting into words the pain they hadn't dared to speak. Tamsin read each message. She didn't respond, but she saved everyone. One night, Evander arrived for his visit and saw the article printed on the kitchen counter. He didn't ask if it was hers. He already knew. He stood quietly for a moment, reading the title. Then he looked at her, eyes raw but steady, and said, I think that might be the bravest thing you've ever done. Tamsin didn't smile, but she nodded, because she knew it was true. They didn't fall back into love like people in movies. There was no dramatic kiss in the rain, no sweeping music. What came instead were small things. He learned to cook breakfast the way she liked it. She began to answer his texts without hesitation. He took Zadie for entire afternoons so she could nap. She laughed at his bad jokes again. He showed up when Zadie had a fever and stayed through the night. She cried once, without warning, and he held her without trying to fix it. Months passed. One morning, Tamsin found a package outside her door. It was wrapped in plain brown paper. No note. Inside was a framed photo. She recognized it instantly. It was the image he had left her during the divorce hearing. A blurry candid taken through a hospital window. Zadie, just minutes old, resting on her chest. She had no idea who had taken it. She didn't care. What mattered was the look on her own face, exhausted, shocked, and full of a love so fierce it almost hurt. Beneath the photo, a line had been printed in simple black text. You were never invisible. She stood there for a long time, holding the frame against her chest as Zadie played with blocks at her feet. That evening, when Evander came to pick Zadie up, she opened the door wider than usual. You have 10 minutes, she said. He looked confused. For what? She shrugged. To convince me not to make you leave. He smiled, that quiet, stunned kind of smile that doesn't need words. She didn't promise forever. He didn't ask for it. But he stepped inside, And for the first time in a very long time, she let the door stay open.